29 nations, with a population of more than 1,400,000,000 persons, attend the historic conference in Indonesia's capital city of Bandung.
It's 1955 and leaders from Africa and Asia have gathered in Bandung, Indonesia. India's Jawaharlal Nehru is there, so is Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, fresh from challenging British rule. Also present are leaders from former French colonies like Vietnam and Syria. Hosting them is Indonesia's founding father, Sukarno. Just 6 years earlier, he led a revolution that forced the Dutch out of the country. This meeting lasts a week, but its impact spans decades. It sparks a movement of global South unity against racism, colonialism, and Cold War control. It fuels anti-colonial struggles in Asia and Africa while inspiring black activists in the US and revolutionaries in Cuba. So, how did Indonesia, freshly free, become the voice of the anti-colonial world? Let's rewind. Indonesia, over 17,000 islands rich in spices, timber, coffee, and gold. That wealth attracted outsiders, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the British, but none stayed longer or went further than the Dutch. In 1602, they formed the VOC, the world's first stock-issuing corporation. It could wage war, sign treaties, and enslave humans. Its mission? Make money at all costs.
So basically, the Dutch were there to make money. The first part of that was the Dutch East India Company, which was the world's largest multinational company at its time, set up to get hold of spices from eastern Indonesia, so nutmeg and cloves and other spices that were only produced in Indonesia.
By 1605, the VOC had seized a Portuguese fort in Ambon, its first stronghold. From there, it battled rivals and built a spice monopoly. Soon, spices weren't enough. The VOC expanded to sugar, tobacco, and coffee export crops that required labor. Their answer? Slavery.
Slavery was a very important part of the Dutch system, first under the Dutch East India Company, and then till the middle of the 19th century it was still practiced in its pure form of slavery by the Dutch government. So previously you had locally based systems of slavery, but the Dutch East India Company, with its demand for labour to establish particularly its base in what is now Jakarta, but also to even send slaves to South Africa, to Cape Town, where the Dutch also had their base.
Between 1600 and 1900, the Dutch trafficked an estimated 600,000 slaves across Asia. Batavia, today's Jakarta, became Southeast Asia's largest slave market.
That continued up until around the middle of the 19th century, when European modes of production changed quite markedly, and the Europeans really no longer depended on slave labour as they had to originally establish their power. So new forms of wage labour evolved, but some of those were semi-slave-like conditions, so particularly indentured labour.
VOC leader Jan Pieterszoon Cohen openly said war was necessary for trade, and war they waged. In 1740, fearing rebellion and needing a show of force, the Dutch massacred thousands of Chinese Indonesians.
A number of the leaders of the Chinese community were allying with anti-Dutch forces in Java, and the Dutch feared that this would lead to a large-scale anti-Dutch action. So they took action first in what turned into a mass riot where there were large-scale killings by ordinary Dutch and other Europeans, but they also encouraged others from different ethnic groups to attack the Chinese, and this was a horrendous massacre of its time.
By the 1800s, the Netherlands possessed a colony nearly 50 times as large as its mother country. Colonial rule didn't go unchallenged. In Indonesia's heartland, Java, the Dutch faced major uprisings, including what became known as the Java War. In 1825, Javanese Prince Diponegoro led a rebellion rooted in land disputes, Islamic revivalism, and anti-colonial resistance. It lasted 5 years. Over 200,000 Indonesians died as a result of war, famine, and disease.
Prince Diponegoro was from the royal house of Central Java, and he organised a large-scale uprising using the banner of jihad against the Dutch, so using Islam as a kind of rallying cry against the Dutch. And that war went on for 5 years. It devastated Central Java. Something like 200,000 people, which was a large proportion of the population of Central Java, were killed during the Diponegoro War. But the Diponegoro War was successfully put down by the Dutch, largely through subterfuge. But in some ways, the memory of the Diponegoro War was very important for Indonesians later on and contributed to the formation of a nationalist movement.
Then came Bali, where the Dutch crushed independent Balinese kingdoms with overwhelming force. But the longest and bloodiest conflict was in the province of Aceh. In 1873, Dutch troops invaded the Islamic Sultanate of Aceh, expecting a quick win. It triggered a 40-year war, the longest colonial war in modern history, and up to 150,000 Indonesian lives were lost.
They again used divide and rule to gain local support of different ethnic groups against the Acehnese, but even dividing the Acehnese. And the Acehnese looked to the Ottoman Empire and looked to the Islamic world for support. And it degenerated into a really brutal guerrilla war where the Dutch eventually evolved the kinds of tactics we still find in modern counterinsurgency to undermine the Acehnese and take them over.
Colonial Indonesia was racially segregated. Dutch elites lived in comfort with access to education, healthcare, and high wages. Indonesians did the labor, paid high taxes, and had little control over their lives. In 1939, Indonesians made up 97% of the colony's workforce, yet earned just 69% of total income. The Dutch, comprising just 0.5% of the population, took home 13% of the earnings. They ran everything from banks and plantations to shipping and the government. Indonesian farmers were forced to grow cash crops like sugar, coffee, and rubber while being denied access to rice, their staple. The system of exploitation, known as the cultivation system, made the Dutch East Indies one of the world's richest colonies, while Indonesians stayed poor and hungry through what is today recognized as apartheid. But resistance was brewing. In 1924, Indonesian students in the Netherlands formed a group called Perhimpunan Indonesia. It was one of the first times Indonesia was used to describe a united people.
In the early 20th century, Indonesians started to recognize a commonality. That is, that Indonesians, so people from all over the archipelago, went from their own islands to Java, largely to Jakarta, but also major cities like Surabaya. And so this is where people started to get a sense of commonality, that they had a common cause and that there was recognition of how much the Dutch economic exploitation was really having an effect on the rest of the population.
Then came World War II. In 1940, the Nazis invaded the Netherlands. The Dutch Empire faltered and Japan saw its chance. It invaded Southeast Asia, seizing the Dutch East Indies. At first, Japan promised Indonesians liberation. They trained them, opened schools, and pushed the slogan, Asia for Asians. But the reality didn't match the messaging. Japan seized rice. Indonesian farmers were forced to grow cotton and castor oil. Famine struck Java, where 2.4 million people starved to death. Around 400,000 Indonesians were forced into labor. By the war's end, Indonesia had one of the highest death tolls worldwide.
Because it was a military occupation, so the Japanese military used their power to try to control the population directly. And I think, like a lot of military rules, it depended on where you were. So some of the more brutal aspects of Japanese rule were felt in eastern Indonesia, where the Japanese Navy was in control, and that's where you get stories of large-scale massacres. And then, certainly communists were targeted by the Japanese. There were also massacres of Chinese that took place in Southeast Asia under the Japanese because they were worried about the Chinese leading resistance. And really, Japanese rule left Indonesia in quite a mess.
In August 1945, as Japan surrendered, Indonesia declared independence, raising the red and white flag for the first time. The move didn't go unnoticed in the Netherlands.
The Dutch really just did not understand how things had changed, because they lived in a kind of fantasy world in the colonial period where they imagined that everything was fine because they didn't necessarily see the overt manifestations of nationalism. So they arrived back and they thought, oh yes, our people are, our subjects are going to welcome us back, they're going to love us. And then there was this huge shock of, no, they didn't want them back. There are a lot of manifestations of this and a lot of reasons why the Dutch did what they did. One was actually an economic pressure that the Netherlands had to rebuild. So the Netherlands had been totally devastated by the war, that people in the Netherlands had undergone their own periods of starvation, the hunger winter, for example. And so the Dutch were very much dependent on the United States for rebuilding, but they were dependent on US capital, and they had to actually repay a lot of loans to the US. So the quickest way to get money was to re-establish your colony and be able to get money from the colony.
The Dutch responded with troops, tanks, and fire. They called it a police action. Indonesians called it war. Entire villages were burned, civilians were tortured, over 100,000 Indonesians were killed. Still, they resisted. Sukarno led guerrilla forces and militias in a determined fight. By 1949, the Dutch gave up, but not without seeking to exploit Indonesians one last time. They demanded 6.3 billion Dutch guilders, approximately $23 billion today, even charging Indonesia for the war itself. Yes, they billed their former colony for the bullets used against them. An outraged Sukarno refused. That's when the US and UN intervened, not for the sake of justice, but to avoid another long Cold War front. A deal was struck. The bill was cut to 4.3 billion Dutch guilders, approximately $15 billion today. Still unjust, still massive, but it got the Dutch out. Indonesia gaining its independence literally paid to rebuild post-World War II Netherlands, its roads, schools, hospitals. Freedom came at a cost to the colonized, who paid in both blood and money.
So Indonesia had to repay the colonial debt, as it were. I mean, I put it in terms of Indonesia having to pay for its own revolution, but technically that's not the case, because they had to pay for an earlier colonial debt. So the remarkable thing is that Indonesia was very quickly able to repay most of that. That Indonesia, through the Cold War and through a stroke of luck, was in the early 1950s the recipient of income from the Korean War. So the Korean War required a lot of minerals, but also required rubber and oil from Indonesia. So Indonesia was in a relatively good position in the early 1950s. And so I guess this is one of Indonesia's success stories, that economically they were able to stand on their own 2 feet. Although in the late 1950s, then the economic context changed quite a lot and Indonesia got into a lot of economic difficulties.
Leading the battle for Indonesia's independence was Sukarno, a bold, fiery anti-imperialist. He wasn't just fighting colonialism, though. He wanted a world free from Western dominance. That vision terrified the West. An oil-rich Muslim country turning to leftist politics? Dangerous. So in 1965, the CIA helped orchestrate a coup to replace Sukarno with pro-Western General Suharto. Sukarno was ousted by 1970. In the chaos, nearly 1 million Indonesians were killed. Leftists, unionists, and students were all branded threats.
But there was a lot of political instability, a lot of changes in prime ministership and rebellions. So there was a major uprising against Sukarno, against the central government, which was funded by the CIA and was a major CIA operation coming out of Sumatra and Sulawesi. What happened was that military leadership organised an anti-communist purge based on an event which is often, one historian has called it a pretext to mass murder. That is, that a communist aligned group tried to purge senior military figures, and this led to a huge backlash, which led to mass murder. Something like a minimum of 500,000 people, but probably more like 1 to 2 million people were killed in that purge, and that brought a right-wing military leader, Suharto, to power and to a much closer alignment with the US.
The CIA-assisted coup became a template for Western intervention around the world and is now referred to as the Jakarta method. Suharto rose to power, ruling for 3 decades as a dictator.
Suharto was a Cold War dictator, and he managed to outlast the Cold War, but eventually Indonesia got rid of him and moved to a return to a democratic system.
In 1998, after mass protests and crises, he fell and Indonesia returned to democracy. Today, Indonesia is the world's 4th most populous nation, a G20 economy, and a rising power. Its journey from colonization and occupation to independence, then dictatorship, and back to democracy is unlike that of any other nation. But the scars remain. Neither the Dutch nor the Japanese have fully apologized. No real reparations were made. Yet Indonesia stands, stronger, resilient, a nation that fought, suffered, paid a hefty price for its freedom, and rose.
The Indonesian Revolution is still this point of pride that people say, we fought for and achieved independence in a really strong fashion. And the Indonesian Revolution was, in its time, a point of inspiration for the rest of the world, for Vietnam, for other decolonizing countries. So Indonesia still has something of that idea of leadership within the third world, or leadership within the global south.